Okay, great. So yes, welcome everyone. We are so excited that you all are here today, and we're so excited just to learn from this presentation and everything David has to share. I'm Bethany, and I'm with AARP Idaho. And so before we dive into the presentation today, I just wanted to go over a few ground rules. I also wanted to introduce David for those of you who weren't here last week, just to hear a little bit about his background and his involvement in everything that we're about to learn about. And then I'll also go over a feature of Zoom just to make sure that you know how to ask questions if you have questions at any point. So just to dive right into it, our ground rules are that participants can leave the class at any time. All of your microphones will be muted. If you have any questions, please ask them in the chat, and I'll show you how to use that in a moment if you haven't ever used it. And also, midway through the presentation, we will have a pause for about 5 minutes of an intermission. So if you have any questions, you can also ask them then. And we do ask that you just stick to professional language and behavior only during class in the chat as well. So really quickly, I did just want to show you all the chat feature. So if you have never used it or if you haven't used it in a while, it will be on the bottom of your screen. So if you pull your mouse or cursor to the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat logo right in the middle. And if you click on it, you'll see a chat box pop up. And so I will be monitoring that this whole session and this whole teaching, just to ensure that if you do have any questions and you enter them there, that I can answer them. And also we will be putting in information there at the end of class as well. So be sure just to look at that. So that's the chat box. And then a brief background of NKA, which is this class session, New Knowledge Adventures, is over 15 years ago, a group of dedicated volunteers came together to create a lifelong learning program in Pocatello in partnership with Idaho State University. And so the volunteers looked at many different models and they decided to create New Knowledge Adventures that had some key components such as affordable access and volunteer governance and volunteer instructors. And now here we are in the fall of 2020, and NKA Treasure Valley is offering online classes due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what's really exciting is we are currently the only New Knowledge Adventure group in Idaho offering online classes. So it's exciting that we're able to use this technology to still connect with everyone and learn. And a little bit about David is David Hobben has been taking pictures and researching cemeteries and graveyards for 20 years. He has been a licensed paramedic for 41 years and has traveled extensively in that occupation, teaching and doing accreditation evaluations of ambulance services and paramedic training programs. He's visited and photographed hundreds of cemeteries in every state and in international locations. And he's written many articles on cemetery history and symbolism. He has presented at both genealogy and paranormal conferences throughout the country and teaches regularly with Boise Community Education and AARP. And he has worked for funeral homes and is also a volunteer tour guide at the old Idaho State Penitentiary. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it over to David. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And to get to that, it's just the bottom of your screen. So thank you, David.
Thank you. One thing she didn't mention is I have no spare time with everything I do. It's been a really interesting learning process the past few months because my primary paramedic occupation is traveling all over the country and even some international locations doing evaluations of ambulance services for an accrediting process. Well, guess what? We're not traveling anymore. So we're trying to do all this online. So we've done a couple of them so far. We're starting to do them similar to this virtually online, which is always a challenge, trying to do vehicle inspections and facility inspections and interviews and things. So I was just telling the folks before everybody hopped on, I'm trying to get used to Zoom and trying to get used to Microsoft Teams. And they just tell me that there are two other main platforms out there that I may be having to learn also. If you were here last week, thank you for coming back. And I'm hoping you all were, because there was quite a bit of information. So we're going to pick up where we left off last time. I do have a couple more rules, so just kind of keep those in mind. So we're going to pick up a little bit where we left off. We had quite a bit of information last week, and we're going to start with again the symbols that you see in cemeteries. Just a real quick little review. One of the reasons that there are so many symbols and emblems and things on grave monuments and markers in cemeteries is because years and years ago, our ancestors were, a lot of them were illiterate. They couldn't read, so you could put all kinds of information, all kinds of texts on markers. And if they couldn't read, it didn't mean anything. So years ago, everybody knew what all these symbols meant. Well, over the years, people have learned to read, and the symbols are still there. They're still used, but people have forgotten what they mean. So that's what we try to do here, is to kind of there's a little re-education on what all these symbols actually mean. Sometimes there are symbols there like roses and leaves and whatnot that are there just because they're pretty, because the person liked them. A lot of times, though, there's an actual meaning to tell you about the person. All kinds of things. Were they an adult? Were they a member of a fraternal organization? Were they a religious person? All kinds of things that you can learn. Um, we're going to pick up with ivy. Excuse me. Ivy, when you see that on a monument, you can see this one here. This is a really large example. Ivy covering what's called it's called a false crypt, because it looks like there's a casket inside, but it's really not. The casket, the burial is still underground, and the false crypt just protects the grave, protects the casket, and these beautiful ivy leaves covering the monument. As you can see, they're fairly worn. It's a fairly old monument, but you can still see them pretty well. And ivy, when you see that on a monument, represents friendship and the memory of the deceased. People really liked the person. The person was well liked. He had a lot of friends. And also, the vine, in a religious sense, represents Christ and immortality. The ivy is always growing. The lily is something that, if you've seen old movies and old photographs, especially old West movies, when the deceased was laying in the coffin, a lot of times, and even some European customs, they would hold these lilies. Their arms would be crossed over their chest, and they'd be holding this big lily. And you can see, we see lilies that are carved in the monuments. We see the graphic on the right there. And basically, lily signifies innocence. It's kind of the restored. It's been the deceased soul has been restored, and it's innocence, and it's a sign of purity. So purity and innocence primarily, also resurrection. Easter lilies, for example, resurrection connected with Easter. Lettering styles even have meanings. This is something that you don't see a lot of, but once in a while it's really interesting to find. If you look at the letters Gracie on the one on the left and the ones on the top of the one on the right that said gone but not forgotten, that's actually a specific type of tree branch. It's called an acacia branch, an acacia tree. And it's pretty evident on Gracie's monument. You can see the definite design of it there. And basically, acacia branches, while they're pretty, they also symbolize the immortality of the soul. The physical body is gone. The soul, however, lives on. The soul is immortal. And those acacia branches are a representation of that. Palm branches kind of relate to Easter also. If you remember the Bible story, the Easter, before Easter, Jesus entered the town riding on the donkey, and the people laid down palm branches on the street for the donkey to walk on. And we have Palm Sunday before Easter. Palm branches are spiritual victory, victory over death, eternal peace, and again, Christ's victory that's associated with his resurrection. So the palm branches you will see Now those are still used even on monuments today. This particular one is quite old. It's back from the night from 1900, but you'll see them carved sometimes. Sometimes we'll see monuments made of zinc or metal that will have those on there. And it's something that's one of the symbols that people have really liked, and it's still used on current monuments today. Whenever you see grapes, primarily that's going to be the grave of clergy, of a minister, of a priest, pastor, and the grapes are associated with. If you look on the one on the left, you'll see there's a chalice in the middle, grapes on the right, and wheat on the left. Same thing with the cross on the right picture there, and those are associated with clergy because that represents the Eucharist, the sacrament, Holy Communion, the bread and the wine, and the chalice. So generally, when you see that, you know that's going to be a member of the clergy that who's buried there. Now, some of the monuments will have these huge stone balls. Some are huge, like the one on the right. Some are smaller. And for years and years and years, people have tried to figure out, holy cow, what does that mean? Does it mean the world? Does it mean the earth? What does it mean? And we found out, guess what? It's pure decoration. Um, they liked it. They liked it. Maybe it means something to the family. Maybe there is a meaning to them, but generally there isn't a general accepted meaning that this is a symbol of. So this is one of the things we found that guess what? It's just because it's pretty, because people liked it. Drapery is seen in a lot of older cemeteries. And drapery has a couple of meanings. First off, it's designed to give the grave, the cemetery, kind of a home-like appearance, where in your house you have drapes, you have curtains in the window, and the drapery is kind of like to make the deceased feel comfortable. These nice drapes, pretty drapes. These are very detailed, as you can see. Uh, Now, during the Victorian era, drapery was very popular, and it was a sign of mourning. Where we pick up the drapery part is that years ago, before there were funeral homes, when someone died, they were put in their casket and they were laid out in the home, in the parlor. And they were there for 3 days, giving people time to come and visit and see the person. And during that time period, uh, they wanted you to think primarily of the deceased. So pictures in the house would be draped, mirrors would be draped, and it was a sign that, hey, don't look at yourself in the mirror, don't look at pictures of other people. We want you to concentrate on the deceased. Now, again, it's a sign of mourning, so you'll see that on a lot of the older monuments. But again, it's designed to kind of give the cemetery kind of a comfy feeling, comfortable for the deceased. This is another example of a draped monument. This is a husband and wife, and each person, the husband and the wife, each have their own obelisk, and they're draped at the top, and you can see they're tied together, indicating that they will be eternally forever. But again, the drapery is a sign of mourning. And during the 1800s, again, when the mirrors and the pictures were draped in the house, think about the deceased, not of anybody else or yourself. And if you're familiar with the term wake, they call that period a wake. They still do to an extent. And there was reason for that. Years ago, they weren't necessarily terrific at pronouncing people dead. And there was a great fear that people might be buried alive. So they would have the person laid out in the house in their casket, and they would do that for 3 days. Somebody would always sit with the person, with the deceased, 24 hours a day, in case the person would, guess what, wake up. So it's called a wake. And it was done for 3 days. Again, it gave people time to come and visit, but also, if that person was really dead after 3 days, you knew it. They didn't wake up. The body started, I guess this is before embalming, the body just started to disintegrate, deteriorate. And it was pretty obvious after 3 days that person was dead, and it was safe to bury them. So here's just some other examples. Draperies on monuments, again, makes it nice and comfy, but also, again, it is a sign of mourning. The body was laid out in the house. It was laid out in the parlor. There was another large room in the house that was for the living. The parlor was for the dead. The other room was for the living. So that's where we get the term living room. And again, just to make the deceased feel comfortable, pillows, for example, you'll see those. This is the entire bed. Nice bed, pillow. You can see the comforter, the blankets, the pillow, even little tassels on the pillow. These were very highly detailed. And again, to make the deceased feel comfy and at home, yeah, let's give them a chair. Let's give them a couch. So you see these periodically. Now, another reason for this, now the folks in the cemeteries now won't tell you this and they don't like you to do it, but those are there for you to sit on when you go visit. That's the idea. They're nice and comfy for the deceased, but also when you go and visit, it gives you a nice place to sit down, to rest for a few minutes, to think about the deceased, communicate with them if you like. And that's a nice spot for you to rest for a bit. Now, if you want the deceased to really feel at home in the cemetery, you make his monument look like his house. The deceased lived in a log cabin, Mr. Drake, Lester Drake. This was his cabin. And they went to great pains, as you can see, a lot of detailing all the different aspects of his cabin, right down to the tools by his door, the plants that were planted around there. And again, to make him feel nice and comfy. These are, of course, very expensive, but they're really beautifully done, as you can see, really detailed. Now, if you didn't have quite enough money to make a large detailed house for the deceased, well, he made smaller ones. And it's still the same idea. They're smaller, but they represent the house of the deceased. So it's a place for them, basically, their home there at the cemetery. Makes them feel comfortable. It's designed to kind of look like where they live, their cabins, their house. And it makes it nice and comfortable for them. You can see the different styles there. You will see urns in cemeteries, and these urns are primarily on the top of what we call a pedestal marker. And it's a pedestal, will have information on it. And then on top of that pedestal, sometimes it's a statue, sometimes you'll see urns. And urns kind of goes back as a Greek symbol of mourning. The body is the vessel of the soul. The urn is the vessel of the physical body that's left. Cremated remains of the dead years ago, when people were cremated, the cremated remains of the dead were placed in urns. Also, drapery on the urns, you can see again that symbol of mourning and also the symbol of the veil between heaven and earth. When the Egyptians, when the pharaohs died, they built the pyramids for them and they made them mummies. They always took the vital organs out of the body first before they mummified the body. They put those organs in urns filled with oil or wine or some type of preservative so that when the pharaoh was resurrected, when he came back, his organs were there for him to still use. Now, you see an urn with flames coming out of the top. Remember, the urn is the vessel of the physical body, the cremated remains. The flames coming out of the top is the soul shooting out, rising up to heaven, rising up from the ashes, rising up to heaven, an undying remembrance. It's kind of like the finger. When you see a hand with the finger pointing up, that means he's up there, he's in heaven. Now, these are something that are really interesting. I don't know if they caught on in all over the country, but there are some places where you see a lot of them. They are actually solar powered liquid crystal displays with pictures in them on top of the marker. A lot of times it's like this one. It's a picture of the deceased, the husband and wife that are buried there, and it's their picture. During the day, the solar panel absorbs the energy from the sun, and at night it glows. And I tell you what, the first time I saw one of these, I'm driving through by a cemetery. It was dark, it was at night, and I see this glowing couple hovering above their gravestone. It was quite an interesting experience till I figured out what it was. But sometimes you'll see that the salesmen in certain areas have been really active, and you may find a particular cemetery or area where there are a lot of them. I actually have not seen too many. mainly in larger cities, but they can have a picture of the deceased. They can have whatever you want, a cross, a symbol, whatever. But them glowing at the night during the in the dark is an interesting experience. Another symbol that's very popular is the cross and the crown. The cross, they were very common religious symbols on grave markers, especially older ones. The cross represents the deceased's faith in God. That means he was a Christian. He was a faithful person. The crown, if you remember in the Bible stories, the crown is symbolic of the crown of glory. You go to heaven, you receive your crown of glory, symbolic of God, the renewal of eternal life, and that crown of glory that you get when you are ascended to heaven. The tricky part of this is that the crown of the cross is also the symbol for a church. The Christian Scientist religion, that is the symbol of their religion. So when you see it on a standard marker like this, generally it's the religious symbol for the faith in God, the cross, and the crown of glory. But it is actually one of what they call an emblem of faith that goes on military markers. And military markers have, I believe it's close to 70 now, various emblems of faith representing different religions that you can have put on a military marker. If you see it on military markers, such as a veteran cemetery, that usually indicates the person was a member of the Christian Scientist Church. This is something that is really, really rare. I've only seen it, I think, twice. Uh, and the first time I saw this, I didn't realize what it was. I was walking around a cemetery. It was getting kind of dark, kind of dusky, and I was trying to get in as many pictures as I could. So I was taking pictures of basically everything I could find. I took this picture, but didn't realize what I had until I got it home, downloaded it to my computer, and enhanced it. It's an elephant. Very rare in Western cultures, but it's a Christian symbol. Uh, the Christian symbol of the elephant, if this was a new marker and you could see it in detail, that elephant is actually trampling on a snake. And that is reference to Christ overcoming death and evil, and Christ is trampling the snake, representing evil and the devil. Very rare that you see that in Western cultures. Also, it goes back to the old phrase, if you remember it, elephants never forget, a sign of undying remembrance. Dogs on markers sometimes are actually represent the dog that the person had, his dog. But a dog itself is basically a symbol: fidelity, loyalty, vigilance, watchfulness. A dog would have loved this person as a master. This person was worthy of a dog's love as a master. And again, sometimes it will represent the dog that the person actually owns. Sometimes it's just a symbol. The one on the right's kind of interesting, the old hound dog up there. And this is what I'm still trying to do research on. Because if you look closely, the hound dog is looking at and hovering over a turtle. I know what the dog means, but I still haven't found out what the turtle means. Maybe the guy liked turtles. I don't know. But a dog is there because the person was really a good person, and the dog would have really loved him. Weeping willow is something that's still used today on monuments, and a weeping willow represents, guess what? Perpetual mourning, eternal mourning, earthly sorrow. We're mourning for this person. It was very popular back in the 1800s, and it's still seen on monuments today. Swords, when you see swords, they're generally military. It'll be military people. Often cross swords or a sword crossed with its scabbard, like the one on the left. The one on the right, you see the several military symbols: the sword, sash, gloves. But generally, when you see that, those are going to be military markers, and often high-ranking officers are going to have those symbols on their markers, their monuments. Open books, holy scriptures, usually the Bible, but whatever the holy scripture is for your particular religion. But generally, the hand holding that open book is representative of the person being of faith. He was a person of faith. He read the Bible. And his hand holding that Bible, he's a person of faith. Now, when you see two books on the one on the right there, you see two books that are closed on top of the marker. They're draped, again, the sign of mourning. Two books generally represent the two books of the Bible, the Old and the New Testament. A closed book is a little bit different meaning. If you're reading a book, you get to the end of that book, the last page, the last sentence, and the story's finished. You're finished reading the book. What do? You close the book. And the book of life, this person's life, the book, his story of his life, has ended. The story is ended, and you close the book. The final act is written. You've read the last page. You've read the last sentence. Now the book is closed. Open books, like you see here, often represent what's known as the book of life. It will have all kinds of information about the person, name, dates, maybe other information, maybe family members, but other information about the person. So kind of the book of their story, of their life. When you see a column that's broken, and basically anything that's broken, usually is a sign of life cut short, sometimes a life that has ended too soon, but it's early grief. It's often a younger person and their life has been cut short or cut off. You can see a couple of different styles there, but the broken column there indicating the end of that person's life. If you look at the one on the right, you'll also see the palm branches on the individual markers for the people. That center tall monument, the broken column is a family monument, family plot, indicates a family plot. Then we have the smaller individual stones for each person. A broken column, like you see here, that's engraved on a monument like that, sometimes that could also indicate the loss of the head of the family. Head of the family is no longer there. The column or the support of the family is no longer there. So you have the broken column. Two columns often represent the passageway, the threshold from this life into the next, kind of like passing through a doorway from this realm into heaven, your next stop. If they're joined at the top, or if they're joined, like you see the one on the left, they're joined by that beautiful line of flowers there. Usually indicates husband and wife. They're joined. They're together for eternity. They're joined for eternity. And again, anything broken generally indicates life cut off or sometimes life cut short. You'll see the one on the left, we have the broken branch from the tree. The tree is the family tree, and the broken branch indicates the deceased. Notice it's not completely broken off. It's still somewhat attached. Physically, they are no longer with the family, but they're still attached spiritually. The spirit's still there. And the one on the right, you can see the broken tree, again, life cut off or life cut short. Broken candles also indicate a life cut short, but this is a very specific one. This is usually seen on the markers of young Jewish women, and it usually indicates a sudden or unexpected death. And I've only seen this a couple of times myself. It's a broken candle on the marker, but most it usually indicates a young Jewish woman that died either very young or unexpectedly. A broken wheel, again, the same thing. They're no longer, their life was cut off, but the broken wheel has another meaning. The broken wheel symbolizes the release of earthly bonds. The person is no longer bound to earth, earthly sorrows, earthly pain, earthly suffering. That broken wheel indicates they are no longer held here on earth with all the earthly bonds and suffering. They are now free, they're now in heaven, and they're no longer bound to the earth's pain and sorrow. This is an Italian cemetery. Actually, it's in California, but it's an Italian cemetery. There's a town in California called Colma, California. And roughly close to 90% of the property in Colma, California, are cemeteries. And I don't remember the exact number, but I believe it's close to 20 some cemeteries in town, every denomination and type that you can think of. And years ago, cemeteries were actually outlawed in San Francisco. San Francisco became a very popular town, and the land became very. Uh, uh, they wanted land available for houses. They wanted to put houses and businesses, and these cemeteries were in the way. And they actually outlawed them. And all the cemeteries in San Francisco back in the 1800s had to be moved, and they were all moved to this town of Colma, which is about a half hour, 40 minutes from San Francisco. So pretty much the entire town was founded on cemeteries. One of the cemeteries there is an Italian cemetery. And a lot of the monuments have this tiled floor of black and white tiles. And again, things have meanings. And it's said that the tiles, the black and white tiles, stand for the eternal struggle between good and evil. Now, sometimes the monuments tell you a lot about the person, not only the name and the dates and whatnot, but again, graphically, visually, they can tell you about maybe the person's occupation or his hobbies. Again, you could write all this stuff out in text on the marker, but if someone couldn't read, didn't mean anything. But now with the symbols here, we can tell what the person's hobby or profession was just by looking at the monument. The one on the left, Captain Sellers, he was a riverboat captain. You can tell he's at his wheel on the riverboat, and he actually is somewhat famous. Captain Sellers was the captain of the riverboat that Samuel Clemens worked on. And Captain Sellers is actually the riverboat captain that came up with the term Mark Twain. On the right, we have a horn player. He was in a marching band, maybe professionally, maybe it was for fun, but he was in a marching band, so his horn is on his monument. So you know that. The gentleman on the right, Mr. Pell, owned restaurants, and he owned seafood restaurants, and he loved fish, eating them. So the three fish that are on his monument are his three favorite fish to eat: a bluefish, a striped sea bass, and a blue black mackerel. And he also loved oysters, so of course the fish are swimming over an oyster bed. The gentleman on the right, years ago, was the inventor of the railway post office car. So there's the railway post office car exiting the tunnel. Lady on the right was a Scrabble player. She liked Scrabble. Gentleman on the right was a blacksmith. Again, if you have imagination, you can put anything you like on your markers. In the West, we see this a lot. Families that owned ranches will often have their brand on the tombstone.
David, can I interrupt you really quick? We had a
Sure.
question in the chat from Janice
Uh huh.
asking what the name of the town was that you just mentioned.
Oh, Colma, 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 California. Hmm.
Thank you.
And it's amazing. You can spend days there. I've been lucky enough to be in that area a couple of times over the past several years. And like I said, I think there's close to 20 some cemeteries there. And it is an amazing place to visit. And again, there's about every type of cemetery you can think of. There's just regular non-denominational ones. There's a Japanese one, a Chinese one. There's a couple of Jewish cemeteries, Catholic cemeteries, Greek cemeteries, Italian, you name it. And it's just an amazing place to visit. So Ron on the left, guess what? He was a computer geek. And if you look right in the center at the top of the marker, he also must have liked Star Trek. The family on the right was involved in real estate. And the husband and wife were in real estate, sold homes. So guess what? Their monument is a home. And it also gives them a comfy little place to hang out, to live. Gentleman was a railroad engineer. Beautiful marker, carved locomotive on there. This gentleman's a fisherman. This is in um, Minnesota, I believe it was. This is a life-size bronze statue of him. He loved to fish, and that's what he wants to do for eternity. So that's what his monument looks like. He's fishing, and you can see the detail on that statue. I mean, his bait bucket, he's got a fish on the line there that he's holding, his fishing pole with the reel on it, and it is life size and very impressive. Gentleman on the left was a firefighter. Robert Fig on the right is known as Bobby Fig, and he was a baseball player. And the symbol of mourning for him as a baseball player is crossed baseball bats. And notice the bats are pointing down. That's the sign of mourning, with them pointing down. Gentleman on the left was an actor, and this is at a Jewish cemetery. It's in Colma, by the way. It's in a Jewish cemetery, and it's really, really interesting and almost rare because generally Jewish markers, Jewish monuments are not nearly that fancy, that elaborate. Regular Orthodox Jewish markers are very plain, but you can see there's one in the background also. But this gentleman was an actor, and he was an actor actually in Russia before he came here. And his monument, he wore masks in the plays that he was in and during his acting career. So his masks are on his makeup table there. There's actually, if you can see it, there's makeup on the table, some books that are there. The mirror that's there is a reflection of his face. And you can see the drapery from mourning, but very elaborate. The gentleman on the right owned an amusement park, and guess what his favorite ride was? The bumper cars. The photograph on the left, the piano, I actually was teaching in Malaysia several years ago. I spent about 5 weeks over there teaching emergency medical courses and got to see some of the cemeteries. This is the grave of a very famous Malaysian concert pianist. It's a beautiful monument. And the interesting thing is that there is a recording of his playing, and 24 hours a day, constantly coming from the piano, is the recording of him playing the piano, different pieces. And it's really kind of strange because when you get close to the monument, if you don't know that, you start to get close to the monument and you hear this beautiful piano music. And you wonder where it's coming from. But it's coming from his monument. The one on the right, a bookcase. So he was a scholar, possibly a teacher, but a scholar. So his books are there. And you can see there's a broken tree there as well. This is kind of an interesting one. It's kind of fun. There's one of the cemeteries in Washington, D.C. is called the Congressional Cemetery. And this is the grave of two sisters that owned a brothel in the 1800s in Washington, D.C. When you see a concrete border around a family grave, around a plot like this, that concrete border is called a bed. Now, remembering that they ran a brothel, if you look at the bed has a headboard, and the headboard says welcome. Gentleman was a blacksmith. Lots of symbols on this one. There's symbols of his profession. You can see at the bottom, there's a graphic of him shoeing a horse. There's a horseshoe next to that, above that, some of the tools he would use. But you also see some of what are called mortality symbols. You see the skull and crossbones. You see an hourglass. Those are called mortality symbols. And they are reminders that if you're there visiting, you're visiting the person, he's deceased. The mortality symbols that are there are reminders to you that guess what? You're going to die too. The Puritans were really into mortality symbols, skull and crossbones, wing skulls, because they didn't have any sense of humor. And they wanted you to always remember, yeah, you're alive and he's dead, but someday you're going to die. And you know what? When you die, you better be good. You better have led a good life so you can get to heaven. So you're going to die too, and you better behave yourself. This gentleman is over in Ireland. I was over there several years ago, and he's a boxing champion, Jack Doyle. Little advertising on this one. Kimmons and Dorothy Wilson, they originated the Holiday Inn hotel chain. So there's a little advertising. The founder of Holiday Inn. And the Holiday Inn hotel chain, there was a Bing Crosby movie years before called Holiday Inn, and that's what they took the name from. But little advertising there for them. Now, you're going to see in a lot of places, you'll see genealogy on the gravestones. It will have the deceased and their name and dates. It'll also have a lot of other information, maybe the children, the parents. So when you see these monuments, there could be a ton of genealogy information about the folks. And you always want to look all the way around the markers, all the sides of the markers, because there could be names all over the place. So they can be some really good hints to genealogy if you're doing that type of work. And here's just some other examples. You'll see several people. The whole family is buried around that monument, possibly. You'll have the children listed on some of them. But you always want to make sure to really look at all the different sides of the marker so you can see all the information that's there. There's a lot of information about Mary here just from this one small marker. Mary McCurdy, you can see the dates, her birth date and death date, but you also now know she was the wife of Joseph, the daughter of John and Letitia, the granddaughter of Mary Scott. She was an immigrant from County Derry in Ireland in 1760. Just on that small marker, a ton of information about her. There are two terms that I thought were kind of interesting when I first saw them: consort and a relict. Consort, I thought, boy, that's got kind of a racy kind of a sound to it. She was a consort. But consort means it refers to a woman who dies before her husband. She predeceases her husband. So Elizabeth died before her husband did, and now she is known as his consort. The term relict means that the husband died first and left the woman a widow. So if the husband died first and she's still alive, she is now his relict. A lot of history on monuments. Again, you just got to take the time to read them. Don't just look at the name and the dates. A lot of other information here. The Bannock War Chief, Buffalo Horn, monument has a lot of information. He's buried actually in the Blackfoot, Idaho area. John Sutter's in California, very famous there. A lot of information about him. And actually, the middle one, where it says Juan A. Sutter, that was a Spanish marker that was placed for him and is now included in this one. But always take time to read the information. Now, husband and wives, just like the wedding ceremony, the wife is buried to her husband's left. This is the headstone. The head is to the headstone. Their feet are farther down, of course, and the wife is on her husband's left, just like the wedding ceremony. There's a term epitaph. An epitaph is a Greek word, and it means on the gravestone. Basically, what it is a little story about the person. The epitaph is a little story about him. You can see the one on the left is at a Boot Hill Cemetery, and it's the grave of George Johnson. And not only did they want you to know his name and his date, but they wanted you to know a little story about him, the circumstance of his death. He was hanged by mistake. He was right and we was wrong, but we strung him up and now he's gone. So little stories about the person. That's called an epitaph. Two kind of interesting ones. One from 1792, Mary Fowler. Apparently not very well liked in her time. Her epitaph reads, Mary, though pleasant in her day, was suddenly seized and went away. How soon she's ripe, how soon she's rotten, laid at her grave and soon forgotten. apparently she wasn't real popular. Now, the bottom one is a young man who died and left a very young widow. And they want you to know that the widow is young and very eligible to be remarried. Sacred to the memory of Mr. Jared Bates, who died August the 6th, 1800, his widow, aged 24, who mourns as one who can be comforted, lives at 7 Elm Street, this village, and possesses every qualification for a good wife. She's ready to move on. Children's graves are always interesting. Um, some of them will have statues. Again, they're very expensive. Statues are expensive, so the family had money. These are just a couple of examples of graves of children with their statues. Willie and Artie Walsh on the left. That's somewhat of an old monument, and it's pretty worn, as you can see, but it's the two children. Francesco at the bottom there, and his statue is actually based on there. You can see there's two photographs of him. The one on the left is what the statue was based on. Died young. Inez Clark, very young, beautiful young lady, and they were smart. The monument is very detailed, as you can see, and it started to get some damage, so they put up a glass case around it to protect it. There is a urban legend about Inez's grave, and supposedly a caregiver that was working one night ran away, never to come back. They claim that she didn't like thunderstorms, and they claim that during thunderstorms her statue disappears. The symbol on the left, the grave on the left, was a very common symbol. Actually, both of them you can see here, a very common symbol in late 1800s, early 1900s for children's graves, especially infants, small children and infants, a pair of shoes and socks. And one of the shoes will be laid on its side. And the shoe laid on its side is the symbol for the death of the child. On the left, we have two children, infant daughters. But the shoes and socks and one shoe will always be on its side. Just some other examples of children's graves. Now, the young man in the wheelchair, he spent his entire life in a wheelchair. And now that he's passed on, he's no longer bound to earth, the earthly sorrows and pain. And if you look at the side picture of his wheelchair, you notice that the wheel is broken. Again, the broken wheel indicates release of the earthly bonds and limitations and pain and suffering. You can get some interesting clues from children's graves. Of course, years ago, there were epidemics of the Spanish flu, of different diseases that went through. The one on the left, the three graves of children. All the children were different ages when they died, but they all died within a week of each other. So that prompts you to do a little research, and we found out that there was an influenza epidemic in St. Louis, where this is, that killed all three children within a week. And another symbol of an infant grave, the little cherub, the little infant leaning up against the broken tree. Again, the broken tree, the life cut short. And just some other examples. The one on the left is 5 children that all died very young. Years ago, when medical care was not very good, infant mortality was very high, and diseases killed children that now we have vaccines for and are considered not very minor. But before vaccines and before good medical treatment, a lot of young children and infants died. This family lost 5 children. The one on the right, if you look towards the bottom of the marker, you'll see an open casket, and the angel is carrying little George out of his casket, carrying him up to heaven. This is up at Pioneer Cemetery. If anybody's ever been up to Idaho City, there's an old Pioneer Cemetery up there that's just amazing to walk around. I've been up there several times. I'm just up there last year. And for years, The picture on the left is of two iron cribs. Basically, it was the grave indicates the graves of two infants, but they didn't know who was there. They just knew there was no name. It was just just the iron cribs. And after tons and years of research, they found out who they were. So now, if you look at the picture on the right, in 2017, they found out who they were. So now the little cribs also have the little standard markers inside with the names and the lambs on the top. A lamb also indicates the grave of a child. Sleeping babies, just a sign of innocence and purity. Died at a very young age, died as infants. And the sleeping baby is very common in the Victorian period. And when you see sleeping babies, statues like this, they will usually have either no clothing or very little. And that symbolizes their innocence. They're innocent and they have nothing to hide, nothing to cover up. Children's graves again. This one's kind of interesting. This young boy was scared to death of storms. He hated thunderstorms. So when he was buried, if you look at the door behind there, it goes underground. There's actually a chamber underground next to his grave. And there's actually a little window that you can look in and see his grave, his casket in there. And during thunderstorms, Mom would actually go down into that opening, go down and sit next to him and comfort him during the storms. Just some other examples. Again, poor medical care, lots of newborns, lots of young children. The large monument there is for Mom. The smaller ones are for her children. 7 children in the family. They all died at very young ages. And the stone, if you look at the Mom's stone and one of the children's stones, you'll find the same death date. And she actually died in childbirth, giving birth to the last child. Mother and infants, sometimes you'll see them on the same stone. And medical care was so poor in the 18th, 19th century that 200 out of every 1,000 births ended up in the mother dying during childbirth. And again, a very high mortality rate for the infants as well. And there's kind of a sad custom. Some cultures, the infant mortality was so high that they didn't name the new baby until they'd reached 1 year of age. And if they reached 1 year of age, they knew they probably were going to make it, so they would give them a name. And that's why on a lot of infant markers, very old ones, they don't have a name of a child. They'll just say, here lies the infant daughter of, the infant son of. Sometimes they didn't have names, which I think is pretty sad. These are called spirit houses. They're up in Alaska. And this is a Russian Orthodox cemetery up in a little town called Iklutna. And they don't have markers as such. They have what are called spirit houses. The spirit houses are for the deceased, of course. You can see the cross in front is the Russian Orthodox cross. And the spirit houses don't have names on them. And I had the great luck to meet up with one of the monks. There's a monastery there. And he spent about 2 hours with me, taking me around, telling me about the history of the cemetery. And the reason there's no names on the spirit houses is because the family knows who's there. God knows who's there. And that's all that matters. The only people that matter. If you look at the one with the red roof on the left, if you look inside, you'll see a little roof actually on the ground inside of that spirit house. That means the woman died while she was pregnant. The spirit house is for her. The little roof inside the spirit house is for her unborn child that was still inside her. Doves represent the Holy Spirit, gentleness and peace. Sometimes they're in flight, sometimes they're resting. Often on children's graves, but sometimes on adults as well. Sometimes they're dead. Kind of sad. The one on the left is a grave of twins that died. They have a dead dove for each of them, and you can see their tree is cut off very short. And the dead dove again just indicating the death of the small child. One on the left is an interesting monument. Mom died in childbirth. The child died as well, was stillborn, so you can see her and the child in the casket. And the dead dove on the right there for the dead child. Lambs are almost always on children's graves. Meekness, gentleness, innocence. And angels. You see a lot of different types of angels. These are angels that are descending the stairs. Uh, angels escort the deceased to heaven. They come down to earth and escort the deceased to heaven. And even the three stairs have a meaning. It's three stairs for the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They guard the tomb. It's a very large angel. And sometimes the angels are actually designed to represent the deceased. They look like the deceased. These statues are statues of the deceased as angels, as they now are in heaven. This young lady was a dancer. She was a ballet dancer. So, as an angel, she is dancing in heaven. Sorrowful angels, mourning angels, very dramatic. This is a fairly popular monument. I have seen this in cemeteries literally all over the country or some variation of it. But the mourning angel was very popular always, and they're mourning at the grave because you can't always be there. You can't always be at the grave eternally mourning that person, but they can be. So that angel is eternally there mourning the deceased. Angels pointing up. Guess what? He's up there. He went to heaven. We talked about breaking free of earthly bonds, no longer bound to earth by the earthly pain and sorrows. On the left, the dove, the bird, is breaking through that rock, no longer bound to earth. The young man on the right there was in a wheelchair his entire life. When he died at a very young age, he is now leaping to heaven. He is no longer bound to earth by the earthly pain and suffering and sorrows. And again, these are beds. As I mentioned before, concrete borders around the grave indicate where the grave are. They're called beds. And we have some statues of women, and they're called eternal mourners. They're not angels. You don't see the wings on them. But eternal mourners are usually young, beautiful women. And they're called eternal mourners because, again, they are always there mourning the person. You can't be there at the grave all the time mourning that person, but they can be. So they represent, women always represent comforting on graves. And so we have women that are there eternally mourning that person. Some very dramatic ones, beautiful statues. And again, they're very frequently beautiful young women and shapely, beautiful young women. Sometimes very thin covering. Again, they're innocent. And women on graves, statues, or carvings always signify comfort. This young lady I have seen so far in 6 different cemeteries all over the country. The company that designed her advertised her basically in a catalog. And so far, I've seen her in Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Decatur, Illinois, Indianapolis, Cleveland, and Evansville, Indiana. The Smith Granite Company in Rhode Island designed her, advertised her, put her in their catalog, and lots of people liked her. And just some other examples of eternal mourners. And the eternal mourners, if you look at the statues, there will always be at least 1 foot, 1 bare foot showing beneath the robes. And that 1 bare foot is a sign of their purity. And again, just some other eternal mourners. This is an eternal mourner on the left, an angel on the right. Now, when you see an eternal mourner or an angel dropping flowers like these, that's another sign of grief and mourning. They're dropping blessings onto the deceased. They're dropping flowers. And again, women on tombstones just are very common, represent comfort. They may be mourning, they may be pointing to heaven, dropping flowers, but they're always there, eternally mourning that person. This is a common symbol, a woman clinging to a cross from the old Rock of Ages, cleft for me. Lost in a sea of sin, our only hope is clinging to Christ's cross. Laurel wreaths are spiritual victory. If you remember years ago, like back in Roman days and whatnot, when the armies conquered other parts of the world and the returning hero, the captain or the guard or the emperor, whoever, they'd return home and they'd have a huge parade and they'd be returning home. They'd always have a laurel wreath on their head, and the laurel wreath indicated victory. They won. A laurel wreath indicates spiritual victory on the tombstones. Just some other examples of laurel wreaths. Wheat is kind of different. There are a lot of symbols that indicate young deaths or unexpected deaths or children's deaths. This one actually, the wheat with the sickle to cut the wheat down, actually indicates a life that was very full, usually a full life, and often over 70 years of age. And we have the wheat, we have the sickle, and it's called the divine harvest. The person lived to be a ripe old age, and now they are harvested, they're taken up to heaven. And just some other examples. And anything again that is cut like this, cutting flowers, for example, anything cut or broken again, like a tree, a candle, a column, that indicates life cut off, sometimes life cut short. And you can see the eternal mourner here with the shears cutting the row of flowers there. Just a quick look at veterans markers, veterans cemeteries. There are two types. There is the national cemeteries, and there's also state veteran cemeteries. The one we have here in Boise is a state veteran cemetery. You can tell because they always have the same standard upright markers. Some also have wall crypts. The veterans markers, the first ones were wood, so of course they are long gone before the Civil War. And then they made the granite markers. 1873, they started using marble or granite, called a Civil War type or a shield type. Had the name and information about the person, their unit, but didn't have dates. The original ones did not have dates on them. The shield type, again, they also used them for veterans of the Spanish-American War. Now, people look at this, and especially today, with all the computer stuff, that bottom line, no, it was not the Spam War. Okay, it's the Spanish-American War and the Mexican War. Still, they did not have dates on them, just the name of the unit. Eventually, 1918, they came up with what's called the general type of marker, standard white marble, rounded at the top. Death date is added now. And originally, there were only two religious symbols. You either had a cross if you were a Christian or a Star of David if you were Jewish. And those are the only two that they had initially. Confederate soldiers also have veterans markers. They have what's called the Confederate Cross of Honor. And if you look at the standard marker here, it's got a rounded top on it. The Confederate soldier marker were pointed. And the story about that, the CSA, Confederate States of America, the story about that is they made the Confederate soldiers pointed at the top to keep the Yankees from sitting on them. Flat bronze markers came around in 1940, also flat granite markers. They used marble or granite for the flat flush markers for the ground level ones. And now there are a lot of what they call veterans' emblems of belief. These are all the different religious emblems that you can have. Basically, if there is a religion and you want to have that symbol on a marker, as long as you can document, I believe that there are, I think it's 10,000 is the number, members, they will consider adding that to their list. The last few that they've added just in the past few years are non denominational. You can see the bottom right hand corner of the second page, the heart, um, the, uh, the hands with the Bible, the angel. There have been some non denominational ones, but if you look at these, you can just go to the Department of Veteran Affairs, their website, look up emblems of belief, and you can see all the ones that are available. I have a personal goal that I'll never be able to do. My personal goal is I'd like to personally photograph every single one. And I believe they're up to 68 now. And I've gotten somewhere in the low 50s. My problem is they keep adding new ones, but there's some that are fairly rare. But I've gotten quite a few of them. Confederate cemeteries, sometimes, unfortunately, they didn't know who the Confederate soldiers were. This is one in Lynchburg, Tennessee. None of the markers have names on them, they just have numbers. The huge monument in the center with the soldier standing on the top is the carving, the text that's on that marker, the wording on that marker is carved at an angle, so you actually have to get down on your knees to look up to read it, and you're on your knees paying homage to the soldiers as you read that. And let's take a little break. Let's do a 5-minute break and stretch or whatever you need to do, and we'll come back.
Sounds good. Thank you, David. So yeah, at this point too, if anyone has any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat and ask them now.
Bethany, ready when you are.
Sounds good. Yeah, so we'll just dive right back in. Thank you.
Okay. Um, if you ever get a chance to go to Mexico or any of the southern, southwestern states, there are some very beautiful cemeteries in the southwest with Hispanic or Mexican influence. The graves there are very colorful, they're very beautiful, and they're very highly personalized. You'll see a lot of mementos left by family members, by friends. You'll see a lot of personalization on these graves. The also the Hispanic graves among and there are other cultures that do this as well. Do what they call mounding or scraping. And first off, it's designed to keep the grave free from any grass growing on it because years ago in the Old West, if grass was there and there was open range, the cattle would come and eat the grass. And you have cattle eating grass on your grandma's gravesite. You didn't want that. So it would keep the area free from grass. And it also was a sign of respect. It kept the grave look like it was new. It was disrespectful for grass to grow on the grave, but it also gave it a fresh and new appearance. So this is often done on a yearly basis, depending on the area. If there's a Hispanic population, it often is done on the Mexican Day of the Dead. So usually on an annual basis, they'll go and they'll clean up and take care of these graves. They're often will have statues of saints or Christ or the Virgin Mary or the Virgin of Guadalupe. Very common. And again, they're very colorful. They're painted, very colorful. Homemade markers are kind of interesting. You can buy the stone, but you can engrave it yourself if you want to. You know, for example, people that didn't have the money to have it professionally done, they would buy the stone and engrave it for their loved one. Uh, Sometimes it was obvious that it was kind of homemade, but these are just a couple examples of homemade markers. The one on the left is a homemade marker. That's in Minneapolis. I found this, and I have no idea what it's supposed to be. Um, I'm not sure where they came up with that, but that's one of the markers. And you can see the one on the right. They bought the stone, and then you can engrave it yourself. There's no hard and fast law that says you have to have it professionally done. In Florida, especially, you'll see cemeteries will have a Cuban influence on their graves. These are called ledgers. This type it covers the grave and protects the grave, and they're covered with very beautiful tile. They're all done with small tiles. We have in Boise a fairly large Basque population. The Basque immigrated over here a long time ago. They liked it, and we liked having them in Boise. If you've been downtown, the Basque Block has some cool restaurants and a museum and things there. And the symbol you'll see on this monument here at the top, that's the Basque symbol. There are a couple of Basque sections, for example, at Morris Hill Cemetery here in town. And you can tell by the names. You can also tell by often they'll have that symbol. Native American cemeteries are very sacred to them. I always recommend if you want to visit, especially photograph, take photos of the cemetery. If it's got any religious connection to maybe one of the churches or in this case, Native American, get permission first before you wander on and start taking pictures and start walking around. Native American cemeteries are very sacred. This one you can see on the left, Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce tribe, that's his grave. But they're also very personalized. Now, Chief Joseph is buried in Washington. And this was years ago. I was going to be teaching up near where the cemetery was. The cemetery is on a Native American reservation. I was teaching at a school on that reservation. And as soon as I knew I was going to be teaching there, um, I contacted the tribe to get permission to visit that cemetery and take photographs. We went back and forth, and it was about a month and a half before I was going to be there. I hadn't heard anything, and it was my first day of the class, and I hadn't heard anything, so I figured, oh, they're not going to let me do it. Before the class started, I was setting up the classroom. The tribal police chief came to the classroom. Said, "Are you David?" I said, "Yes, sir." And all he said was, "It's okay." That was it. He said, "It's okay." And he left. So I knew at that time that it was okay for me to walk on to visit the cemetery. Here's some Native American graves. They are also very personalized, very decorated, beautiful. And it's very much the Native American custom, like the Hispanic, to leave a memento there of some type that you were there. This is the Italian cemetery I mentioned earlier that's in Colma, California. And again, the black and white tiles representing the struggle of good and evil. And the cemetery itself is extremely beautiful. If you didn't know you were in California, you'd swear you were in Italy. Chinese cemeteries. This is also in Colma, but of course, most of the monuments are going to be in Chinese. Now, a lot of them will have Chinese on one side and English on the other, but they're always very interesting to visit. And a lot of the Chinese cemeteries, and this actually, the top one here, is in the Chinese section just over here at Morris Hill in Boise. These are called funerary burners. And there's a Chinese custom when someone dies and they go to heaven, you want them to be wealthy in heaven and have wealth and items and things. And literally what they will do is they will make tissue paper models of houses, of cars, a special money called hell money for some reason. Why it's called that, I'm not sure. And anything else, any other earthly possessions that they might have, tissue paper models. And then during the ceremony at the cemetery, those items will be burned in the funerary burners. And there's a little opening at the top. And the smoke that comes out of those, the smoke that goes up to heaven, carries all of that wealth and all those items with that person. So they will have those and be wealthy in heaven. This is what's called the hell money. They burned in the funerary burners. And you can see they're huge denominations. And they want that person to have that money, to have that property up in heaven with them. Now, when you see a Chinese marker, and part of it is in red, like the right side of this one, Carming's information is in red, that means he's not dead yet. He's still alive. The monument was made when Catherine died, and on the left you can see her picture, her birth date, death date, and information on her, and it's in black lettering. Carming, all you see is the birth date. You do not see a death date yet because he's not dead. Red is the color of life, Chinese color of life, and his information will be there. They already went ahead and put his information there with the exception of his portrait and his death date. And then when he dies, his death date will be added and all of the red lettering will be changed to black. But red on Chinese markers indicates the person's still alive. Now, old sections of Chinese cemeteries, you'll see these very old markers in Chinese. There's a fair chance that these graves are empty. Years ago, these are actually, the one on the right is over just here at Morris Hill, but there's a Chinese section there. These old markers, when someone died, they would bury them locally, wherever that happened to be, put up a marker for them. But the custom was that as soon as the family could afford it and make the arrangements, the person was disinterred here, sent back to China to be buried back in China with the rest of the family. It's important that they be with the rest of the family. So many of these older Chinese graves, there may be no one there anymore. Crosses, of course, indicate a Christian burial. And Catholic graves especially, but other denominations as well, but Catholic graves especially often will have an image or a statue of the Virgin Mary or a saint. Just some other examples have Mary, the Virgin Mary, the statue on the left. On the right, we have the Holy Family. Also, it's called a crucifix. And the crucifix is the cross, but Christ is still on that cross, so it's called a crucifix. The rosary on Marie's flat marker here, her bronze marker, that tells us she was Catholic. Now, these are very interesting graves. I've seen these in a couple of cities. We actually have one now in Boise. The Romani people, also known as gypsies. Gypsies are very well known for having they put a great importance on honoring their dead. And they have very elaborate, expensive monuments for their dead. Often, if there's a large population in the area, they'll have a separate section in the cemetery specifically for those. There's actually a few names that are very common. This particular one was back in Chicago, but they often will have portraits of the person, especially like this one. You can see these are laser etched portraits. On these above ground crypts, the caskets are actually inside this crypt, and they're usually very large. They're often above ground, but they're usually very elaborate, and often have religious statues, again, like the laser etched portraits here. If you happen to be out in the area of Cloverdale Cemetery, a little over a year ago, the local Romani people bought a section. Reserved a section at Cloverdale Cemetery, Cloverdale Memorial Park and Cemetery, for their families. And there is one of these. There's one that looks almost identical to this, an above ground crypt out there at Cloverdale. Very elaborate. You can see there are spaces for several more. It has walkways. It has benches. It has lights. The pathways are lit up. It's very beautiful. If you happen to be out in that area, just take a drive through the cemetery. You can't miss it. LDS graves will often have, when an LDS couple gets married, they're often married in what's called sealed in an LDS temple. And often that temple will be engraved on their monument. And again, the crucifix is the cross that still has Christ nailed to it, and a cross is just a simple cross. So that's the difference between the two. Generally, it's Catholic monuments that will have the crucifix. Some other religions will use that also. Now, the Eastern Orthodox cross is a little different. You can see there's some extra pieces added. We have the standard crucifix, the standard cross with Jesus on it, but there's a top piece and a bottom piece. The top piece is where the sign was nailed. If you remember your Bible story, there was a sign nailed on the top of the cross that says, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." That top cross piece is for that. The bottom cross piece is the foot support that was there. Now, taking it one step farther, you notice the foot support, the bottom cross piece there, the foot support, is at an angle. If you remember your Bible story, Jesus was crucified between two thieves. The one to his right repented. The one to his left didn't. That's why the right side of that footpiece is pointed up for the thief that repented and went to heaven. The one on his left did not repent, and the piece is pointing down, angled down, because he did not go to heaven. The Muslim cross, crescent and star, the Islamic crescent and star. There is both Morris Hill and Cloverdale have separate Islamic sections now. You'll see this symbol on them. The one on the left is called a Greek cross, and it looks like a plus sign, but it's called a Greek cross. The one on the right is the Celtic cross, and that's a combination. kind of Christian and other beliefs. And it's the cross within a circle. It represents the sun, represents eternity. Some other Christian symbols. You're going to see a symbol that almost looks like a dollar sign, and it's the letters IHS. And you'll see that on some monuments. It's the IHS is the abbreviation. It's the Greek abbreviation, the first three letters of Jesus's name, and Jesus, Savior of mankind. The Roman version is IHC, and you'll see that sometimes. But the IHS, the first three letters of Jesus's name, the abbreviation, you'll see on a lot of monuments. Jewish cemeteries are always kind of interesting to go to. There is one huge Jewish cemetery in Chicago called Jewish Waldheim, and each congregation has its own separate cemetery, kind of a sub-cemetery within the large one, and it has over 130 sections, 130 different Jewish congregations in that, and each have their own separate little entrance like these. The symbol that you see, the Star of David, and on the top picture there, the little symbols to the right and the left of the Star of David, that's the Jewish abbreviation. The Jewish symbol means here is buried, or here lies. Orthodox Jewish burials must take place within 24 hours of the death. There is no embalming. There are unfinished wood caskets. The bottom of the casket must touch the earth, so that in a lot of cemeteries, you'll have a vault, a concrete vault, and then the casket's put inside the vault. With the Orthodox Jewish cemetery, since the bottom of the casket has to touch the ground, the earth, the vault, the casket's actually placed in first, and then the vault is inverted and put on top of that. They're buried in cotton clothing that disintegrates quickly, no metal. The caskets themselves, again, are all unfinished wood, no metal handles at all. And the whole idea is so that everything, the body, the clothing, the casket, all disintegrates and goes back to earth very quickly. You'll see lions on some Jewish monuments. Lions represent the law or the Ten Commandments. And if you go to a Jewish cemetery or a Jewish section, Morris Hill, for example, again, has a large Jewish section, you'll often see small stones placed on the top of the monuments or the markers. These are left to represent the visit of a friend or a relative. Someone's come to visit, and in remembrance of that visit, they will leave a small stone. Sometimes it's a coin, but generally it's a small stone. It's called setting of the stone. It's based on a Jewish tradition, and you leave that little stone there in remembrance of your visit. A couple of folks that I've talked to say that they take it one step farther, and you take that little stone and you knock a couple of times on top of the monument, like you're knocking on their door saying, "Hi, I'm here," and then leave the stone there in remembrance. Flowers die. You don't see flowers too often on Jewish graves. They die, they're gone, but stones don't. They're always there. They're a symbol of permanence of memory, and you're permanently remembering and always remembering that person. And the memory continues to live on. Just some other examples. And sometimes you'll see Jewish markers, especially Orthodox Jewish markers, that will have the dates based on the Hebrew calendar as well. For some reason, Jewish cemeteries and Jewish sections in cemeteries often are very crowded. Like this one, you'll see. They're often, for some reason, they're very crowded. They don't get a lot of space. And this probably goes back to when there were Jewish sections in regular Christian cemeteries, if you want to call them that, non-Jewish cemeteries. And it was kind of like, okay, well, we'll give you a little piece of ground over here. So they didn't have much room. So they had the graves are fairly crowded sometimes. Now, the hands. These are the hands on a Jewish stone. When you see those, if you're a Star Trek fan, do you notice what those look like? The Vulcan symbol, the Vulcan hand that Spock raised, the Vulcan salute. Both Leonard Nimoy and Bill Shatner are Jewish, and they needed something to make some type of Vulcan salute that was different, so they stole the Jewish blessing sign for using in Star Trek. It represents the hands of the priests or the Cohens. Another symbol you'll see is of a hand pouring water into a basin, and this is the rabbis would have a ritual washing of their hands, and the hand washing was always facilitated by either a Levi member of the Levi family or a descendant, and that represents the hand of a Levi pouring the water into the vessel for the priest to do the ritual washing. A lot of times, in Orthodox Jewish burials, they will also, if possible, obtain some soil from Israel to be placed inside the casket of the deceased. That reaffirms that person's connection with the homeland. And again, Orthodox Jewish burials, the casket has to touch the ground. So it's actually pretty rare that you see Jewish entombments in mausoleums. Memorials are put up in cemeteries for tragic events or near the location. This is the cemetery in Littleton, Colorado. Remember years ago, the Columbine High School shooting. And this is a memorial to each of the students that was killed. Some of these are actual graves, not all of them. Some are just cenotaphs for the person, meaning it's a memorial to them, but they're not actually buried there. But there are several that actually are buried in this cemetery where those crosses are. If you get a chance to go to Oklahoma City, the monument, the memorial to the Oklahoma City bombing is amazing. And among those where the bombing took place, there is a chair for each person, each body that was found, and the chair is where the body was found in the rubble. And if you look, you'll notice that that second row has some smaller chairs, and those are chairs for children. Again, just like graves and grave coverings are smaller for children, same here. The chairs for the children that were killed are smaller, and they light up at night with the person's name. This is just over at Morris Hill. And again, a lot of these things prompt you to do a little research. The big heart in the middle is mom. The three on each side, the smaller ones, are her 6 children. They all died the same date. So you wonder, okay, what happened? Was it an epidemic or whatever? You do some research and you find that mom and the 6 children all died in a house fire. And I'm not sure when exactly it stopped, but for years afterwards, the husband was not home. He was at work. And for years afterwards, every week, he would come and put fresh flowers on each of the graves. I haven't seen that for a long time, so I'm not sure if dad's still around or what. But when you see a lot of stones like this, or a number of stones with the same death date, do a little research. Find out what happened. This is up at Dry Creek Cemetery. Notice the death dates are all the same on the 3 children, different ages. They all died in a car crash. But when you see that, you're a little curious, do some research. Now, the early 1900s, the Egyptian style became very popular in mausoleums and tombs. Kind of coincided with the finding of the pyramids, the discovery of the pyramids, the pharaohs, and all of a sudden, Egypt and Egyptian motif became very popular with cemeteries and deaths in this country as well. This is a mausoleum that has, you can see, several Egyptian symbols, the winged cobra on the top, the columns, the window inside has a picture of the pyramid. And the Egyptian stuff became very popular with death customs and cemeteries here. The winged cobra is the meaning. The meaning is death. On the right, above the door, you can see the Ankh, which is the symbol of life and immortality. It's key shaped because it suggests that it can unlock the gates of death. So you see those symbols. Excuse me. When all this became very popular, there were some cemeteries that would not allow pyramid shaped mausoleums or Egyptian style mausoleums or graves in their cemetery because they represented pagan beliefs. They didn't want pagan symbols in their cemetery. So here's just a couple examples. Some pyramid monuments. They're very beautiful, and you see the winged cobras, um, the basically the Sphinx statue out there. But initially, some cemeteries did not allow those. So what do you do if you want a pyramid mausoleum, but you want it in a cemetery and they won't allow it? What do? You put a Christian symbol on it. So the one on the left, they added a cross. Now, because it's got a cross, it's okay. The one on the right, we have an angel. The angel is symbol of heaven. Now, since it has a Christian symbol, now it's okay. So you can put your pyramid in my cemetery. Pyramids also, the design was supposed to be prevented the devil from reclining on your grave. Devil couldn't lean on your grave because he slid off. The term mausoleum, basically it's a house for the dead, looks like houses. The term mausoleum comes from way back to 353 BC. King Mausolus died, and his wife had this humongous tomb built for him. Looks like a house. This is a house for the dead, for her dead king Mausolus. So now from here on in, all these above ground house looking type monuments for the home of the dead, the entombment of the dead, are called mausoleums. These are some modern ones. Basically what they are, they're walk-in buildings that contain indoor burial crypts, either in the floor or in the walls, sometimes just out in the center. But they're walk-in buildings that contain the dead. Some are fancy, some aren't. These are just some examples. You may have families connected by marriage that are in the same mausoleum. They'll share too, because they are very expensive. But they're above ground. The person, for some reason, whatever reason, didn't want to be buried in the ground. The one on the left, if you go up to Milwaukee, Milwaukee is the home for a lot of different beers, a lot of breweries. So you see all the founders of those breweries up in Milwaukee, Schlitz and Blatz and Pabst are all up there. The one on the left is the Blatz family. If you've heard of Blatz beer, that's their family mausoleum. The one on the right is amazing. This one is actually in Indiana, in Indianapolis, Indiana. Probably one of the most elaborate mausoleums I've ever seen for a family. These are called economy mausoleums. You build a mausoleum, and then if another family builds one right next to yours, there's a wall that they don't have to build. It's already there. So they just add on and use your same side wall, and that way that makes it there's a wall they don't have to put up or pay for. So you put a whole bunch of them in a row. They're called economy mausoleums because there's one of the walls that don't have to be built because it's already there. Underground mausoleums, they're huge mausoleums, but they're covered with a hill, with earth, with grass, with landscaping. It's called a tumulus. Some fraternal organizations will have these, some religious groups. This particular one is from a company in the Civil War, but it is the tumulus. The plural is tumuli, if you ever see more than one of them together. And it's a mound of earth that covers the grave or the mausoleum or the tomb. Technically, it's underground. A couple of different examples. The one on the right is called Elks Rest, and it's for members of the Elks fraternal organization. But it's covered by a hill, covered by a mound of earth. Community mausoleums are in larger cemeteries. Basically, it's a huge uh, mausoleum for anybody, hundreds and hundreds of crypts sometimes. And it's not like a family crypt, or you don't have to be a member of the family or related to the family. It's just for anybody. So anybody that doesn't want to be put in the grave in the ground, they can get a wall crypt in one of the community mausoleums. They also sometimes contain what are called a columbarium. And a columbarium is a wall with small niches for urns and other items with cremated remains. The wall crypts inside the community mausoleums, and this is what the columbariums look like. Just small containers, small boxes, if you will, containing the cremated remains in an urn or whatever. And you can put anything you want to in there, decorate them, personalize them, whatever. This is the only thing that's left in San Francisco. I told you they'd outlawed cemeteries in San Francisco. A group called the Neptune Society, a cremation society, operates a huge columbarium with thousands of these little niches in them. And that's the one entombment or burial place that still exists in San Francisco. It's amazing to walk through. This is where I might end up. I grew up in the Chicago area, back in Bohemian National Cemetery in Chicago. They have a separate wall crypt for Chicago Cubs fans. And the wall is brick. It's designed to look like the back wall, the brick wall of Wrigley Field. Wrigley Field, the wall back there has ivy growing on it. So, of course, there's ivy. And the benches and things you see there are old ones from Wrigley Field, from the Cubs baseball field. And you can be entombed in that if you like. Above ground crypts are very popular in New Orleans, if you've ever been there. And of course, the story is that their water table is so high that if they try to dig graves, they fill with water right away. So they have to bury everybody above ground in these above ground crypts. Uh, the crypt can contain literally dozens of entombments, because what happens is that the body is placed in the tomb in a wooden casket, and the tomb, the crypt is sealed up, and it's called an oven crypt because it gets to be like 400 degrees inside there. And after a year and a day, everything disintegrates. The flesh, the wood, all that's left is the skeleton, the bones. They take those bones, put them in a bag, put them in the bottom of the crypt, and then the top shelf can be used for another entombment in the family. The one on the right is a family above ground crypt. It actually contains the remains of 32 people. You put the deceased in there, seal it up. You can't open it up for a year and a day, though. That's the tradition. It takes a year and a day for everything to disintegrate, and then you can use it again. There was a tradition years ago in New Orleans, and if a married man could actually have a mistress, and it was kind of accepted. They even had balls and dances that these men could go to look for a prospective mistress. And a lot of times, the mistress was buried in the family crypt with the rest of the family. These two are kind of interesting examples. The gentleman had a mistress, and he was going to have her entombed in the family crypt. And his wife said, "Like heck you are. She ain't going to be in my family crypt." So he had to build a second one just for her, next to the family one. This is what the inside looks like. The top shelf is where you put the newly deceased, and you put them in there. They're in a wooden casket, and you put them in there on that top shelf. You seal it up, and after a year and a day, you open it back up. Everything is disintegrated. The only thing that's there is there might be some wood still left, and it's only the bones of the body that are there. And the wood from the casket is removed. What's left of the body, just the bones, is placed in usually a canvas or a velvet bag, and that's pushed to the back, and it falls to that lower level. That way, now the crypt is available for the next entombment when the next person dies. If you have a family member that dies before that year and a day, you can't open up the crypt until it's been a year and a day. You have another family member that has died, you actually can rent a wall crypt for them. You store them temporarily in a wall crypt, and then after a year and a day, and you can open up your own family crypt, and you can have them moved and placed in the family crypt for a year and a day. These are just some above ground crypts. Now, there are two things that look similar. The above ground crypts, but there are also what we talked about them last week, false crypts. False crypts look like they are above ground crypts, but the body is still buried underneath in the ground. The false crypt is solid. There's no openings. Could be like a sarcophagus, could be like something looks like this, but it is solid and the body is still buried underneath. The reason for that, it goes back to last week we talked about wolf stones, huge markers, boulders that were placed over graves out in the prairie to protect them from the wolves. Uh, Ledgers were fancier ones, but the purpose of the above ground crypt, the purpose of the false crypt is to be cover the grave and protect it from being desecrated by animals, dug up by people, or whatever. It's to protect the grave. It's just fancier. It's just fancy. We want this to be prettier. We want it to be fancier. So we're going to make it look like an above ground crypt. But it's really just a solid monument. The above ground crypts actually contain the caskets. The caskets are in this crypt, not buried in the ground. The way you can tell if it's an above ground crypt or if it's a false crypt is look for air vents. If you look at the front, you see there's an air vent on the bottom, the front part of this above ground crypt, and on the top. Caskets, no matter what they tell you, are not airtight forever. They're sealed and they're airtight for a period of time, but when the body disintegrates, starts going back to its elements, gases are created, liquids are created, and it creates a pressure. Eventually, the contents, the liquids, things like that, can leak out of the casket. And if the casket is really, really airtight, sometimes the caskets even blow up because of the pressure. These air vents are for that purpose. If you have something inside a casket inside, the pressure gets too great, it blows up, things like that. You don't want the pressure in the crypt itself to get high and damage the crypt. So you have air vents that release that internal pressure. So if it has an air vent, it's an above ground crypt with the casket actually there. If it's solid, there are no air vents, it's a false crypt and the burial is still underground. And the false crypt just protects the grave. Now, just a little bit here, we got a few really unique monuments to show you. And if you have a lot of money, if you have a lot of imagination, you can do anything you want. So we'll just kind of finish up showing you these. Mr. Baker on the left bred prize horses, thoroughbred horses. So he has a beautiful horse on his monument. The one on the right you saw earlier invented the railway post office car. This monument is really, again, it took a lot of research, has 3 dates on it. Mark, you can see, died at a fairly young age, but there's 3 dates. What we found was that Mark was born in 1979. When he was only 1 year of age, he suffered some very severe brain damage. Basically, he was brain dead, but his body continued to live. And his body actually died. He died in 1991. So 1979 is when he was born. 1980, his brain died. His spirit, his personality, you might say, died. And then in 91, his body actually died. This was an engineer of a steam locomotive. He stayed at the controls of the train, of a runaway train, until it crashed. So you have the train parts. And again, just some really beautiful, unique monuments if you have the money and the imagination. This also took a lot of research. There was a lot of controversy on this one. Bottom line says victim of the beast 666. Everybody thought, oh my gosh, she's a devil worshiper, she's a Satanist, whatever. They finally figured out what happened. Lily's ex-husband is the one that bought the stone when she died. Her ex-husband was a huge conspiracy theorist. Everything was the fault of the government. The government was responsible and blamed the government for everything bad that happened. So he blamed his ex-wife's death on the government, and the government was the evil beast 666. So by saying she was the victim of the beast, he's saying she was the victim of the government that was responsible for everything bad. George Pullman invented the Pullman railway car. He was so hated by his employees that when they were just scared to death, the employees, when he died, were going to dig him up and desecrate his body. He's buried in a lead-lined casket wrapped in tar paper, coated in asphalt that's an inch thick. His grave is said to be 13 feet long, 9 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and covered in an 18-inch concrete slab. And once the casket was in the grave, a steel cage made of T-rails from the railroad were placed over the casket. And it was all buried in cement. Nobody can get him out. Again, just some beautiful monuments. Mom died in childbirth. Her child died a month later. There was a very large department store chain back in the Midwest based in Chicago called Marshall Field's. This is the Field family, their family monument. And a huge eternal mourner guarding that grave. Dexter Graves was a pioneer who settled in Chicago. And if you ever heard of Kimball pianos, that's the Kimball family monument. A very ornate Jewish monument. This is also in Colma, a Jewish cemetery in Colma, California. Very ornate. And again, just a beautiful eternal mourner. Gentleman on the left was a newspaper publisher. Now, the one on the right, the statue on the right, isn't actually a grave marker. It's just a statue in the cemetery. It's called the Pilgrim. Excuse me. And the story that goes along with that, if you look under the cloak of the pilgrim and stare into his face, you will die within a year. Some other unique eternal mourners. Lady played an organ here on earth, so now she's playing an organ in heaven for the angels. These are statues of the deceased. Statues made to look like them. The one on the left, that's George Pullman's again. The one on the right was an artist, an architect. This was kind of interesting. This is in a Jewish cemetery. It's the last name of the family. It was kind of interesting because there's a bench behind the marker, if you want to take advantage of that. You've seen the one on the left, Harry Houdini, his monument. The gentleman on the right, before he died, said he always wanted to eternally be able to look at his wife's face. So that's a statue of him holding a replica of his wife's face, so we can always look at her. The one on the right's a soldier that died in battle. Karen Carpenter and her family used to be in a community mausoleum in a forest lawn property. If you happen to go to a forest lawn cemetery in California, It's okay if you walk around the cemetery itself and take photos, but when you go inside the community mausoleum, there are signs all over that say no photographs allowed. I really wanted a picture of Karen Carpenter's crypt. Don't ever do this. I'm telling you now, never do it because it's not right. I took my camera, hid it under my coat, and went into the community mausoleum, found the crypt, and took a picture of it. Somebody heard my camera go off. They came over to me, said, "You don't you see the signs? You can't take pictures in here." And I lied through my teeth. I pointed at another crypt on the wall and said, "I'm really sorry. These are my grandparents, and my family can't come to visit. And I wanted to send them a picture of my grandparents' crypt." Lied through my teeth. Please don't ever do that. But they believed me. They said, "All right." They kicked me out, though. They kicked me out of the cemetery, but they let me keep my film. This is when I was using 35 millimeter film. So I have it. Months later, they were moved. They now have their own mausoleum. So everybody blames me. You said, "Yeah, see, you took the picture. They had to move them." Paul Revere is just up here at Morris Hill. Paul Revere and the Raiders, the group. He lived here in Idaho, lived in Garden City when he died, grew up in Caldwell, toured with his band right up until the year before his death. He and his wife picked out the spot for his monument. It's right on a corner. You can easily find it. And also, he wanted an historical spot. He is just literally 20 feet from Harry Orchard, the man that blew up Governor Sternberg back in 1905. Beautiful laser etched monument of him. Michael Jackson's crypt is on the left. I happen to have a friend who has a crypt for his parents and himself in the same building, so he sent me a picture. Jim Morrison's grave from Paris. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and Sr., their family monument. Jimi Hendrix, the musician, he's in Washington. Beautiful monument there. Of course, the Kennedy family in Arlington National Cemetery. Jack Daniels, or Jack Daniels whiskey. Jack Daniels buried in Lynchburg, Tennessee. And unfortunately, his distillery is in a dry county. You can't buy Jack Daniels in the county that it's produced in. But he's buried there. Little chairs, you can go sit, talk to him. Buddy Holly, the day the music died, he's buried in Texas. Marilyn Monroe's crypt in Hollywood, there's a cemetery called Hollywood Forever. She has a crypt there. And now to her left, I'm sorry, it might be to her right. Next to her, do you know who's buried next to her now? Howard Hughes. Or Howard, I'm sorry, Hugh Hefner, not Howard Hughes. Hugh Hefner from Playboy magazine. He got the crypt next to her. Jane Mansfield is buried in a little cemetery in a little town, Penn Argyle, Pennsylvania. That's where she's from. Al Capone was originally buried in Mount Olivet. He became such a tourist attraction, they were afraid people were going to dig him up and desecrate him. The cemetery kicked him out. Had to be exhumed and moved to another cemetery. He was moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery, but the cemetery didn't really want it known that he was there, so they put a huge bush in front of the family monument. Finally, in 2008, they figured everybody knew where he was anyway, so they took the bush away. His whole family is there. John Dillinger, Frank Nitti. John Dillinger's father was scared that somebody was going to dig him up, so the grave is filled with concrete and scrap metal over the body, the casket. John Wilkes Booth is in the family plot in Baltimore. His name is on the family monument there that you see on the left, but the cemetery refused to allow his individual grave to be marked. So he's in an unmarked grave there in the family plot. Lee Harvey Oswald has a small brick in the cemetery, and the cemetery staff has been instructed to not tell anybody where he is if you ask. Luckily, I know some folks that showed me where he was, and Jack Ruby's buried back in Chicago. This is just a little subdivision out in Meridian. They were building the subdivision. They were putting up the houses, and guess what they found? Found a little cemetery. So they were very good about it. They cleaned it up, put a nice fence around it. Now right in the center of this housing development, is this nice little cemetery, family cemetery. Be careful when you're walking around cemeteries. You might not be alone. Wildlife hangs out there. Deer. There's actually been a family of deer that comes back and lives at Morris Hill during the winter. The one on the left, I was in a town of all things called Moose, Wyoming, photographing a cemetery, heard some rustling, happened to look and saw this young guy looking at me. But you find deer, a lot of times geese. The problem with the geese is there's droppings all over the place. And there was a horse corral next to this one cemetery, and I went to take a picture of the horse. He stuck his tongue out at me, gave me a raspberry. And just all kinds of fun. A little white rabbit, the little white cat followed me around. And he followed me around for a while, and then he went back, and he always returned and sat on the very same grave in the cemetery. Dry Creek used to have a cemetery cat. He died a few years ago. He was a black cat that walked around. And he was like a comfort cat. He'd come up to you, rub your leg. Sometimes I do not get out of my car. Rattlesnakes, alligators, no. I stay in the car. Some other cemetery wildlife. This is down in Florida. And he posed for me. This guy couldn't believe it. He's at a cemetery, says, don't park on the grass, no parking on the grass. He pulls up, parks on the grass, actually got out of his car, went over and looked at the sign, went back to his car, got flowers, and walked off. Please obey the signs. He's probably parked on somebody's grave. And just a little humor. Again, if you've got a sense of humor, let people know. I love that one on the top, see other side. Bottom, well, this sucks. Mom had a secret Christmas cookie recipe, and she said, you will get my recipe over my dead body. So when she died, they put her recipe on the tombstone. Scrabble on the left, this little phrase on the right, I knew this would happen. Jaws on the left, obviously a Rolling Stone fan on the right. Gentlemen like pool. Another computer geek. And I like the one on the right there, Micah. I see dumb people. This one's down in Florida in Key West. I told you I was sick. Another one, I'm just resting my eyes. Thanks for dropping by. That's just up at Dry Creek. The one on the left is in dog language. Attention, dogs. The one on the right, Cemetery Lane, dead end. No kidding. I like the one on the right. The monument with him is in the outhouse. The one on the left is kind of scary. Radioactive material from nuclear research is buried there, telling you not to dig. You might be in danger. Look in the upper right-hand corner of the roof of this mausoleum. What do you see? Tombstones made while you wait. Be careful where you buy your tombstones. They're not always artists. Taxidermy at the cemetery. In only, no exit. So, the whole idea, the past 2 weeks, gets you interested. Cemeteries, if you take the time to walk around, read the stones, look at them, tons of history, beautiful artwork, nature, and just the ones here in town, Morris Hill, Dry Creek, Pioneer, so much history and beauty there. Really encourage you to go visit one. Visit relatives and things that you have there. But thank you guys for coming, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, David. I learned so much and it was so informative and interesting. So thank you. Um, yes, so just to close, I just wanted to thank David for his time and everything that he put into this presentation. And thank you all for attending. And if Steve had an announcement just with a quick survey for you all too, questionnaire.
And it's next week that we're doing Who Lies Beneath. And that's just a presentation on the famous and infamous and interesting folks buried in the Treasure Valley.
Yes. And Steve,